Hey friends, in today's video we have a PDH gameplay for you featuring Erinis, Malcolm, Rilsa, and Syr Konrad. For those of you that don't know, PDH is a variant on Commander EDH where your life total is 30. You can choose any uncommon for your commander and commander damage is 16. However, my LGS plays a little bit different. They force you to use a legendary uncommon and they play with 21 commander damage. And then ban cards include Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study. Just so you know, this is an edited presentation of a gameplay. I know when I watch gameplays, sometimes the board states can get convoluted and I don't really know what's going on. So I do it this way, hopefully making it a better viewing experience for all of you. In first seat, we've got Erinis, and he's choosing to use Street Urchin as his background. Goal of this deck is to control the board with his activated ability through Street Urchin. Having Death Touch allows him to destroy creatures and then hopefully get value off of fetch lands and the like, such as Evolving Wilds on attack. Next up, we've got Malcolm paired with Kediss. This is a Spellslinger deck, which tries to utilize cards like Thermal Alchemist to deal damage to opponents, untap, and get extra damage off of those pinger-type creatures. Kediss helps us to accelerate that game plan through Malcolm dealing extra damage, and then Malcolm also helps us to accelerate our game plan, giving us extra treasures. In third seat, we have Rilsa Rael Kingpin. She tries to utilize initiative and complete dungeons so she can boost up her creatures. She tries to keep initiative with evasive small creatures like Fairy Seer and then pump them up with her ability, giving them +5/+0, First Strike, and Death Touch. Going last is Syr Konrad, who's going to try and control the board state with Edict type creatures such as Accursed Marauder and Crypt Rats to help wipe the board. Syr Konrad likes to do this because whenever creatures die, he gets to deal damage to all of his opponents. He also has a mana sink in that he can force everybody to mill the top card of their library. Alright, going first is Erinis, and he's going to open up with a forest. Passes the turn to Malcolm, who plays an island, and passes the turn to Rilsa, who will play a swamp. Passing to Konrad, who plays a swamp as well. And then we'll play a Blood Fountain, an artifact that will give him a blood token and can be sacrificed to return 2 creatures from his graveyard to hand. Passing the turn to Erinis, who will open up with a mountain. And then for 2, play the Viridian Emissary, a 2/1 that when it dies allows Erinis to search his library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. Passing the turn to Malcolm, he'll play a mountain and then play Thought Scour targeting Erinis. First card Erinis will mill is a Gaia's Gift, the second one being Krosan Tusker, and then Malcolm will draw a card. Passing the turn to Rilsa, who plays an Ice Tunnel, can tap for a blue-black and enters tapped. And passes to Konrad, who untaps and plays a Swamp. And then we'll play a Creeping Bloodsucker, which triggers at the beginning of upkeep, dealing a damage to each of Konrad's opponents and gaining life equal to the damage dealt this way. Erinis is going to untap and then go to combat, attacking Konrad with the Viridian Emissary. Konrad chooses not to block and goes down to 28. And then after combat, Malcolm's going to play Skred, dealing 2 damage or damage equal to the number of snow permanents Malcolm controls to the Creeping Bloodsucker. And that'll destroy it. Second main phase, Erinis is going to go ahead and play a forest and then bring himself onto the battlefield. Passing the turn to Malcolm, he'll untap, play an island for a turn, and then Malcolm will hit the battlefield. Passes the turn to Rilsa, who untaps, plays a swamp for turn, and for 2 mana plays the Raven of Fell Omens, a flying 1/2 that will drain opponent's life whenever Rilsa commits a crime, which is targeting anything an opponent controls. And then Konrad will untap, play the Witch's Cottage, which will enter the battlefield tapped as he doesn't control 3 swamps. And then for 2, we'll play a Mind Stone. and passes to Erinis, who untaps and for 3 plays a Spring Bloom Druid, which enters and allows Erinis to sacrifice a land, and then search his library for 2 basic land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Erinis is going to choose to sacrifice a forest and get a forest and mountain and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Going to combat, Erinis and Viridian Emissary will attack Malcolm, who chooses not to block, and then on attack, Erinis will trigger getting the forest just sacrificed by the Spring Bloom Druid onto the battlefield. And Malcolm will go down to 25, and then at the start of Malcolm's turn, he's going to play an island and go to combat, attacking Erinis for 2 in the air. No blocks, down to 28, which will trigger Malcolm's ability. So Malcolm will create a treasure token. Second main phase, Malcolm will play the Unruly Catapult. And then sacrificing Malcolm's treasure, will play Kediss. Passing the turn to Rilsa, she will open up with a Feed the Swarm on Erinis, which will trigger the Raven of Fell Omens. And all of Rilsa's opponents will lose a life, and she'll gain a life. And then Erinis will be destroyed, going back to the command zone, and Rilsa will lose 3 life because Erinis had a CMC of 3. Going to combat, the Raven will attack Malcolm, bringing his life total down to 23. Passing the turn to Konrad, who untaps and pays 3 for a pointed discussion, drawing 2 cards, losing 2 life, and creating 2 blood tokens. Or a blood token, I'm sorry. And passes the turn to Erinis, who will play a forest for turn, and then plays the Hoarding Ogre, which on attack allows Erinis to roll a d20 and create treasure tokens relative to the number on the die. Going to combat, Erinis will attack Konrad with Spring Bloom Druid and the Viridian Emissary, bringing his life total down to 22. And passes the turn to Malcolm, and then Malcolm will play Ophidian Eye on Malcolm, which allows him to draw a card whenever he deals damage to an opponent. And then going to combat, Malcolm and Kediss will both attack Rilsa. No blocks, so she'll take some damage, and then a bunch of triggers hit the stack. First one being Malcolm creating treasure token. And then Ophidian Eye will draw some cards, and then Kediss will cause extra damage to be dealt to Erinis and Konrad. And then that extra damage will trigger both Ophidian Eye and Malcolm again, so we'll see some more treasure and more draws for Malcolm. And then second main phase, Malcolm will activate the Unruly Catapult to deal a damage to each of his opponents. And then play Sleight of Hand, which again activates the Unruly Catapult, allowing it to be untapped. And then Malcolm's going to go ahead and look at the top 2 cards of his library, put one of them in the hand and one on the bottom. Sacking a treasure, Malcolm will Island Cycle Lorien Revealed, and pass the turn to Rilsa, who plays Vault of Whispers for turn. Goes to combat and attacks Malcolm with the Raven. And then second main phase plays the Creeping Bloodsucker, which we've already seen from Syr Konrad. While that's on the stack, however, Malcolm's going to go ahead and activate the Unruly Catapult to deal damage to each opponent. And while that trigger's still on the stack, Malcolm will sack both treasures to play Think Twice. Unruly Catapult's going to go ahead and untap. And then while Think Twice is on the stack, Rilsa is going to play Dispel to counter Think Twice. Raven of the Fell Omens is going to trigger because Rilsa committed a crime. Each of her opponents will lose a life and she'll gain a life. Dispel is going to counter Think Twice. Unruly Catapult is going to deal damage to each of Malcolm's opponents, and then we will see Creeping Bloodsucker hit the battlefield. Passing the turn to Konrad. Konrad's going to go ahead and play a Swamp for turn, and then bring himself onto the battlefield. Passing the turn on end step, Erinis is going to play That's Mine, the adventure side of Grabby Giant, creating a treasure token. and then untap and bring himself back onto the battlefield. And also sack a treasure to bring the street urchin onto the battlefield. Going to combat, we will see Viridian Emissary and Springbloom Druid attack Malcolm, and the Hoarding Ogre attack Rilsa. Hoarding Ogre triggers on attack, and Erinis rolls a 20, therefore he will create 3 treasures. And then we will see the Unruly Catapult block Viridian Emissary, while Springbloom Druid and Hoarding Ogre go unblocked. At the end of turn, Malcolm's going to go ahead and activate the Unruly Catapult, dealing damage to each of his opponents, and then untap, and again activate Unruly Catapult, another damage to each of his opponents. For 1, he's going to play Shore Up, giving Kediss a +1/+1 counter and hexproof until end of turn, and that will trigger the catapult, untapping it, and then go to combat, attacking Erinis for 2 in the air with Malcolm. In response, Erinis is going to activate his ability through Street Urchin, paying a mana through a treasure and sacrificing the Viridian Emissary to deal 1 death touch damage to Malcolm. On death, there's 2 triggers. Viridian Emissary is going to get Erinis a land. It'll be a mountain, which enters the battlefield tapped. And then Syr Konrad, because something died, will deal a damage to each of his opponents. Then we'll see Erinis' ability resolve, dealing a death touch damage to Malcolm, sending it back to the command zone, which will again trigger Syr Konrad, dealing a damage to each of his opponents. In Malcolm's second main phase, he'll activate the Unruly Catapult, dealing a damage to each of his opponents. And then for 3, play Winged Words to draw 2 cards, which will trigger Unruly Catapult's ability, untapping it. And then we'll see an island from Malcolm. Passing the turn to Rilsa, she'll untap and go to Upkeep, which triggers the Creeping Bloodsucker. Each opponent's going to be dealt a damage, and she'll go ahead and gain 3 life. And then we'll see the Raven go to combat and attack Malcolm for 1 in the air. And second main phase, Rilsa's going to go ahead and play the Hidden Acropolis. Comes in tapped and has the option to sacrifice it and discover 4. And then for a single 1, we see Jace's Phantasm, a 1/1 flyer that can be a 5/5 flyer if an opponent has 10 or more cards in his or her graveyard. Passes the turn to Konrad. He goes straight to combat, attacking Rilsa. Rilsa chooses not to block, and Syr Konrad's going to go ahead and play Toxin Analysis, giving himself Death Touch, but more importantly Lifelink and Investigating. So he will create a Clue token, and then deal some damage and gain some life. In the second main phase, we will see the Chain Devil hit the battlefield, which forces each player to sacrifice a non-token creature. Erinis is going to sacrifice his Springbloom Druid, Malcolm the Unruly Catapult, and Rilsa the Creeping Bloodsucker. Before sacrifices, the Unruly Catapult is going to go ahead and be tapped to deal a damage to each of Malcolm's opponents. And then after all those creatures die, Syr Konrad's going to have 4 triggers, dealing 4 damage to each of Konrad's opponents. And Konrad will pass to Erinis, who untaps. For 2, plays Nature's Lore, getting a forest to the battlefield. Goes to combat, attacking Konrad with both Erinis and the Hoarding Ogre. Hoarding Ogre will trigger, and he'll roll a 4, giving him a single treasure. Combat damage will be dealt, and second main phase we'll see the Crimson Fleet Commodore enter, a 5/2 with Trample. That'll give Erinis Monarch. And at the end of turn, Monarch will trigger, drawing Erinis a card. Malcolm will untap, and once again bring himself back onto the battlefield. Pass the turn to Rilsa, who plays a Swamp for a turn. Goes to combat, attacking Erinis with both the Phantasm and the Raven. Before combat damage, Erinis is going to go ahead and activate his ability, sacrificing a treasure to deal a death touch damage to Jace's Phantasm. This will trigger Konrad, forcing each opponent to lose a life. And then Erinis is going to go ahead and activate his ability again, sacrificing another treasure, this time targeting the Raven. Again, Konrad will trigger and more damage will be dealt to his opponents. And then second main phase, Rilsa will bring herself onto the battlefield, giving her initiative. So she will go to the secret entrance, getting a basic land from her library and putting it into her hand. Passes the turn to Konrad, who untaps. For 2 mana, plays Exhume, making each player choose a creature from their graveyard and put it into play. Konrad's going to choose the Chain Devil, which will force each player to sacrifice a creature. Erinis gets the Viridian Emissary, Malcolm the Unruly Catapult, and Rilsa the Raven of Fell Omens. All of these will also be the creatures that get sacrificed to the Chain Devil. The only one being of any relevancy is the Viridian Emissary, as it will allow Erinis to get a land from the library back to the battlefield tapped. Erinis gets a Forest. And then on all of those death triggers, Konrad's going to deal 4 damage to each of his opponents. Going to combat, attacks Malcolm, who chooses to block with Kediss. Kediss will be sent back to the command zone, and that'll also give Konrad another trigger. And everybody's life is looking pretty low now. Second main phase plays the Audacious Thief, a 2/2 that on attack forces Konrad to draw a card and lose a life. And passes the turn to Erinis. Erinis is going to go ahead and play a Mountain for turn. And then play an Evolution Witness. The elf comes with the ability to adapt for 2 mana, giving it 2+ counters. And whenever she gets a plus counter, you can return a permanent from your graveyard to your hand. Erinis is going to go ahead and activate that adapt ability, and so when she gets those counters, she'll go ahead and get a Viridian Emissary from her graveyard to hand, and go ahead and also pay the 2 mana to play it. And then Erinis will activate his ability, sacrificing the Viridian Emissary to destroy Konrad. However, before he dies, he will see the Viridian Emissary be sacrificed, dealing a damage to each of his opponents. And then when the Viridian Emissary dies, it does get a Forest from the library to the battlefield tapped. And then we'll see life totals look like that. Konrad will then go back to the command zone. And then Erinis will activate his ability again, this time sacrificing a treasure to deal a death touch damage to Rilsa. She will also go back to the command zone. And then we will see Erinis attack Malcolm, the Crimson Fleet Commodore attack Rilsa, and the Hoarding Ogre attack Konrad. On attack, the Hoarding Ogre will roll an 11, so Erinis will get 2 treasure tokens. Malcolm's going to go ahead and block Erinis and go back to the command zone, while Rilsa will be knocked out, Konrad choosing not to block. Erinis is going to go ahead and take the initiative when he deals damage to Rilsa, so he will enter the secret entrance, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into hand, and then go to end of turn, triggering the Monarch and drawing a card. Malcolm's going to go ahead and untap, and for 2 mana play Is It Charm, targeting the Commodore. However, Erinis is going to go ahead and activate his ability, sacrificing the Commodore to deal a death touch damage to the Audacious Thief. The Thief will die, and Is It Charm will fizzle as it has no legal target. And then Malcolm will play the Trinket Mage, allowing him to tutor up a artifact with CMC 1 or less from his library to his hand. He chooses to get the Experimental Synthesizer, which will give him some card advantage should the game go long enough. And passes the turn to Konrad. Plays a Swamp for turn. And then we'll play the Dusk Legion Zealot, which when it enters will draw him a card and lose him a life, taking his life down to 6. For 4 mana, the card he drew was Pestilence, which will allow him to deal damage to each player and creature at the cost of 1 black. If he would have had this card, he could have actually taken Erinis out of the game and gotten Kediss a little bit lower, but as he didn't, he was going to go ahead and pass the turn to Erinis, which will trigger the Undercity. Erinis moving into the forest to put 2 +1/+1 counters on the Evolution Witness, which will also trigger its ability, so Erinis will get the Viridian Emissary from his graveyard back to his hand and go ahead and pay the 2 mana to put it onto the battlefield. He's going to go ahead and activate his ability to deal damage to the Dusk Legion Zealot, sacrificing the Viridian Emissary, which will get another forest from his library to the battlefield tapped. And then he's going to go ahead and go to combat. The Hoarding Ogre will trigger on attack, giving him another treasure. And we see Evolution Witness attacking Konrad, while the Ogre and Erinis attack Malcolm. Malcolm chooses to block Erinis with the Trinket Mage. Konrad will be knocked out from the Evolution Witness, and Malcolm left with 1 life. And then second main phase, Erinis is going to activate his ability, sacrificing a treasure to deal the final damage to Malcolm and Kediss, knocking them out of the game. Hope you guys enjoyed that gameplay. Really close there in the end. Unfortunately, Rilsa's deck didn't really pop off. She had several cards in hand that required 2 blue and kept a bit of a greedy hand, not able to get that second blue until it was too late. However, the Creeping Bloodsucker did a good job of keeping her in the game a little bit longer than would have otherwise been feasible, in that it gained her 6th life, I believe. Jace's Phantasm also ended up being a 5/5 when it attacked, so pretty cool to see a 5/5 flyer on the board for 1, especially in PDH. You don't see a lot of big flyers there. I actually thought Syr Konrad was going to win this game, as he was just taking everybody's life down so fast. Ran out of gas there at the very end. Was cool to see the Chain Devil whittle opponents' boards down, and then Konrad used Exhume to basically deal 4 damage to everybody, forcing them to all get a creature back and then sacrifice it. The Malcolm deck is actually probably the most complicated of these to play, as the sequencing of it is really important, and the Malcolm player made a huge mistake in that they played Shore Up when they didn't need to. I don't know why they targeted their Kediss just to untap an Unruly Catapult. Catapult got in a bunch of damage, but the Shore Up would have allowed him to protect Malcolm, at least for 1 more turn from a Erinis trigger, and the game would have played out a little differently had Malcolm not been removed, maybe drawn some more cards off of Ophidian Eye. That sequencing shows you how important it is to use your cards and triggers and everything at the right timing. And then Erinis, our winner, Viridian Emissary, a big highlight for him in that he was able to get a bunch of lands from his library onto the battlefield tapped. Hoarding Ogre was also great, especially on first attack, getting him 3 treasures. Big deal to get those. Gives Erinis a lot more freedom to move and operate, in that his background allows him to sacrifice artifacts to deal damage to things, so cool to see the Ogre help him out in that way. If you liked the video, you should consider subscribing by clicking the button in the top left. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by giving this video a thumbs up or by leaving a comment down below. Otherwise, YouTube thinks you'll like the video in the top right, or you could check out either of the playlists on the bottom. And as always, have a great day.